August 12, 1944. A field hospital somewhere in Normandy, France. The grenade had torn through his boot, shredding flesh and bone. 18-year-old Günter Gräwe lay on a makeshift cot, surrounded by the groans of dying men and the metallic smell of blood. American medics moved through the chaos with practiced efficiency. One of them knelt beside him, checking the tourniquet, and said something in English he couldn't understand. But the tone was gentle, almost kind. In that moment, as morphine dulled the fire in his foot, Gräwe made a realization that would define the rest of his life. He had just become the luckiest soldier in the German army. Before we continue with this remarkable story, if you're finding value in these untold histories, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Berlin or Boston, Tokyo or Texas, your support keeps these stories alive. Share this video with anyone who believes that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity can surprise us. Now let's return to that field hospital in Normandy, where a teenage German soldier's war was ending just as his real education was about to begin. The Americans processed him quickly. Within hours, he was loaded onto a truck with other wounded prisoners. The convoy moved west, away from the thunder of artillery that had been the soundtrack of his brief military career. Gräwe had been a soldier for less than 3 months. He'd joined the Wehrmacht voluntarily, just days after his 18th birthday, not because of ideology, but because that's what young German men did in 1944. His father had been drafted years earlier and died within 12 months, leaving his mother alone with 2 children in the small West German town of Lüdenscheid. Now Günter was following that same path, except his journey was taking an unexpected detour. The scale of what was happening didn't register immediately. How could it? He was one boy from one town in a nation of 70 million. He didn't know that by August 1944, Germany had already lost the war in every meaningful sense. While he'd been drilling with outdated rifles, America had produced 17 million tons of steel that year alone. While his family scraped by on rationed bread, American factories were churning out 1 Liberty ship every 42 hours. The industrial machine that would reshape the post-war world was operating at full throttle, and Günter Gräwe was about to experience its abundance firsthand. The Queen Mary had once been the height of luxury. Now she was a troop ship, repurposed to ferry tens of thousands of American soldiers across the Atlantic. But she also carried German prisoners in the opposite direction, back to the United States, far from any possible rescue or escape. Gräwe boarded her in late August with hundreds of other captured Wehrmacht soldiers. The ship's interior had been stripped of its Art Deco elegance, replaced with bunks stacked 5 high. Still, there was food. Regular meals. More food than he'd seen in years. The crossing took 5 days. Gräwe stood on deck when he could, watching the endless gray Atlantic roll beneath clouded skies. Some of the other prisoners were defiant, singing German songs in low voices, convinced the fatherland would rally and turn the tide. Others were quietly relieved, their eyes carrying the haunted look of men who'd seen the Eastern Front. Gräwe was simply confused. He'd expected prison to mean suffering, deprivation, perhaps cruelty. Instead, American guards handed out cigarettes and treated wounds with care. The cognitive dissonance was profound. They docked in Dover, Maine in early September. The prisoners were loaded onto trains, not cattle cars but actual passenger cars, for the journey west. America unfolded outside the windows like a fever dream. Towns untouched by bombs, bridges intact, factories belching smoke from production lines running 3 shifts, farmland stretching to the horizon, abundant and green. One prisoner muttered that it was propaganda, that the Americans had built fake prosperous towns along the rail line to demoralize them. But the journey went on for days, crossing the entire continent, and the prosperity never ended. Fort Lewis, Washington. The train pulled into the prisoner of war camp on a September morning, when mist still clung to the Douglas firs. The camp sprawled across cleared land, near what would later become Joint Base Lewis-McChord. 60 barracks buildings arranged in neat rows. Guard towers at the perimeter, but not the machine gun nests and barbed wire trenches of German camps. Soccer fields, a canteen, As Gräwe stepped off the train, an American officer checked his papers, noted that he was Wehrmacht, not SS, not a Nazi party member, and assigned him to a barracks. The officer spoke matter-of-factly, almost bored. This was routine. Processing another batch of prisoners in a war America was already certain it had won. The barracks were simple wooden structures, each housing 40 men in bunk beds. Gräwe claimed a corner spot on a lower bunk. The building wasn't insulated, and he knew the Washington winter would be cold. But there were blankets. And that night, the first meal arrived: meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and coffee. Real coffee. Not the chicory substitute he'd grown up drinking. The portions were generous. The food was hot. Around him, grown men ate in silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. Not from sadness, from the sudden, overwhelming realization that they'd been lied to about everything. The camp operated on a system that baffled Gräwe at first. Prisoners who cooperated and worked were paid 80 cents a day, actual American currency. Those identified as committed Nazis received only 10 cents. The work assignments varied: picking apples in eastern Washington orchards, harvesting potatoes, even picking cotton in Arizona during the winter months. The labor was hard, but not punishing. Breaks were regular. The guards were watchful, but not brutal. And at the end of the week, Gräwe had money in his pocket for the first time in his life. The canteen was where the real education happened. Prisoners could purchase items with their wages: candy bars, Coca-Cola, ice cream, cigarettes, soap, writing paper. Gräwe stood in front of the shop counter one afternoon in October, staring at the choices with genuine bewilderment. The last time he'd tasted ice cream in Germany was before the war, when he was a child. Coca-Cola was something he'd only heard about in whispered stories. He bought both. The first sip of that Coca-Cola was a revelation: sweet, fizzy, utterly foreign. He thought of his mother and sister back in Ludensheide, rationing their bread, and felt a mixture of guilt and profound gratitude. In that moment, he understood with perfect clarity that being captured by the Americans rather than the Soviets was the difference between life and death, between humanity and horror. The days settled into routine: morning roll call, breakfast, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, free time for soccer, cards, reading. The prisoners were allowed to write letters home, though Gräwe knew his family wouldn't receive them. The mail system in Germany was collapsing along with everything else. An American officer gave lectures about the war, showing newsreels of liberated concentration camps. Most of the prisoners refused to believe it. They shouted that it was propaganda, Allied lies designed to break their morale. But some, like Gräwe, watched the footage of skeletal prisoners and mass graves and felt something crack inside. Could this be real? Had they been fighting for this? Winter came to Fort Lewis with rain and occasional snow. The barracks grew cold at night, but the stoves were kept supplied with wood. The food remained consistent and plentiful. Christmas arrived, and the Americans organized a celebration with extra rations and even small gifts. It was surreal. Gräwe was a prisoner of war, thousands of miles from home, yet he was warmer and better fed than he'd been as a free citizen of the Third Reich. The irony was almost too large to comprehend. By spring of 1945, news filtered into the camp that Germany was collapsing. The Rhine had been crossed. Berlin was surrounded. Hitler was dead. The war in Europe ended on May 8th. The prisoners gathered in the yard to hear the announcement, and the reactions were mixed: relief, grief, confusion. Some wept for Germany's defeat. Others celebrated their survival. Gräwe felt mostly numb. He was 19 years old. His entire adolescence had been consumed by war, and now it was over. What came next? The months after Germany's surrender brought changes to the camp. More prisoners arrived from Europe, but also more freedom. Work assignments became more varied. Gräwe found himself on a crew that traveled to farms throughout Washington and Oregon, helping with harvests. The American farmers treated the prisoners with cautious courtesy. They weren't friends exactly, but they weren't enemies either. One farmer's wife made sandwiches for the crew's lunch, thick slices of ham and cheese on fresh bread. Another farmer let them swim in his pond on hot afternoons. These small gestures of humanity accumulated, reshaping Gräwe's understanding of who the enemy had really been. The American soldiers guarding them were young men too, many of them draftees who'd rather be home. They shared cigarettes with the prisoners. They showed photographs of girlfriends and families. One guard from Wisconsin taught Gräwe basic English phrases. The language lessons became a daily ritual during the long truck rides to work sites. Good morning. Thank you. How much? Where is... The American was patient, correcting pronunciation with a grin. Language, Gräwe realized, was a bridge. With every new word, the propaganda that had painted Americans as monsters became harder to sustain. In June, a Red Cross representative visited the camp to document conditions. The inspection was thorough. The representative interviewed prisoners randomly, asking about food, treatment, medical care, working conditions. Gräwe told the truth. He was treated well, better than he'd expected, better than he probably deserved given what Germany had done. The representative nodded, making notes, then asked if Gräwe knew about the Geneva Conventions. He didn't. The representative explained that prisoners of war had rights under international law, that America was bound to treat them humanely. Gräwe listened with growing amazement. There were rules for war, and America was following them. The contrast with what he learned about the Eastern Front was stark. Letters began arriving from Germany as the mail system was restored. His mother wrote that their town had been occupied by British forces. She was safe. His sister was safe. But the stories filtering back from the East were nightmarish. German prisoners in Soviet camps dying by the thousands from starvation, disease, and execution. Gräwe's barracks mate had 2 brothers captured by the Soviets. Neither survived. The randomness of it haunted him. He'd been sent west instead of east because of a foot wound, because of which field hospital he'd been taken to, because of 1,000 tiny accidents of fate. That accident had saved his life. Summer turned to autumn again. Gräwe's 20th birthday came and went. He was no longer a teenager, but he didn't feel like an adult either. What he felt was suspended between worlds, no longer German in the way he'd been raised, not yet anything else. The camp held over 3,000 prisoners by late 1945, and political tensions began to emerge. The hardcore Nazis formed their own clique, intimidating anyone who spoke positively about the Americans. There were beatings in the barracks. The Americans responded by segregating the camp, moving the Nazi prisoners to a separate compound. The atmosphere improved immediately. Education classes were offered: English, mathematics, American history, vocational training. Gräwe enrolled in an English course and a carpentry workshop. The classes were taught by American soldiers and local volunteers. They weren't trying to indoctrinate the prisoners exactly, but they weren't neutral either. The American history lectures emphasized democracy, freedom of speech, civilian control of the military. The contrast with Nazi Germany was left implicit but obvious. Gräwe absorbed it all like a sponge. He was learning how a different kind of society functioned, one that had just defeated his homeland with overwhelming industrial and organizational superiority. The Marshall Plan was announced in June 1947. The American instructor in Gräwe's class explained it carefully. The United States would provide billions of dollars to rebuild Europe, including Germany. The prisoners were skeptical. Why would America help its defeated enemy? The instructor smiled. Because a prosperous Europe is a peaceful Europe. Because hungry people turn to extremism. Because we learned from the mistakes after the First World War. It was a level of strategic thinking that seemed almost naive to men raised under totalitarianism. But as Gräwe thought about it, he realized it was actually profoundly sophisticated. America wasn't just militarily powerful. It was playing a longer game. By 1948, the camp population was declining. Prisoners were being repatriated in waves, processed through screening to identify war criminals and hardcore Nazis. Gräwe's turn came in March. His record was clean, a conscript who'd fought for 3 months, wounded and captured. No evidence of war crimes or Nazi Party membership. He was cleared for return to Germany. The prospect filled him with mixed emotions. He wanted to see his family. He missed his homeland. But he was also returning to a country in ruins, occupied by foreign powers, its future uncertain. The journey back across the Atlantic was on a transport ship far less comfortable than the Queen Mary. But Gräwe barely noticed. He stood on deck watching America recede into the distance and realized that he was leaving the place where he'd been treated better as a prisoner than he'd ever been treated as a free man in Germany. The thought was almost too painful to hold. It meant that everything he'd been taught about the superiority of the German nation was a lie. It meant his father had died for a criminal regime. It meant that the suffering of his family, the destruction of his country, had been not only futile, but evil. Germany in 1948 was a moonscape of rubble. Gräwe returned to Lüdenscheid to find his hometown partially destroyed, food still scarce, the population demoralized. But American aid was beginning to flow. The Marshall Plan wasn't just propaganda. Trucks arrived with food, medicine, and building materials. His mother wept when she saw him, thinner than she remembered but alive and whole. His sister had grown into a young woman, working in a local factory. The family was intact. In a nation that had lost millions, that simple fact was a blessing. Gräwe found work in an import business. Germany was being rebuilt, and there was demand for trade expertise for people who could navigate the new international economy. He discovered he had a talent for it. The English he'd learned at Fort Lewis gave him an advantage. His understanding of American business culture, learned through observation and those education classes, proved invaluable. He rose quickly through the company, eventually taking ownership. In 1950, he married Christel, a woman from a neighboring town who'd also survived the war's chaos. They built a life together. 2 sons, Ulrich and Matthias, a comfortable home, a successful business that would eventually pass to his sons and grandson. The decades passed. Germany rebuilt, prospered, joined NATO, became a pillar of the European community. The scars of the war faded but never disappeared. Gräwe rarely spoke about his time as a prisoner. It seemed almost shameful, not because of how he'd been treated, but because his time in America had been better than his time in Germany. How do you explain to your children that you ate better as an enemy prisoner than as a free citizen of your own country? How do you reconcile that reality with national pride? But he never forgot. In the back of his mind always was the memory of standing in that canteen at Fort Lewis, choosing between ice cream and Coca-Cola, making a decision that would have been unthinkable in Germany. That memory crystallized something essential about the difference between the two nations, the two systems, the two visions of how human beings should organize their societies. One had led to catastrophe and genocide. The other, for all its flaws, had led to abundance and mercy. Christel died in 2014, 2 years before the idea began to form. Gräwe was 90 years old, his body failing but his mind sharp. He read news about the Syrian civil war, about ISIS prisoners being executed on camera, about the brutality of modern conflicts. And he thought about Fort Lewis, about American guards sharing cigarettes, about farmers' wives making sandwiches, about being paid to work and allowed to buy ice cream. The contrast with what was happening in the Middle East was overwhelming. He felt a sudden, urgent need to say thank you. Not just for himself, but for all the men who'd been spared the fate they'd have met in Soviet camps or ISIS prisons. Before he died, he wanted to go back. His family thought he was insane. 91 years old, planning a trip from Germany to Washington State, planning to ride a bicycle, from the base gate to his old barracks. But Gräwe was insistent. He contacted HistoryLink, a Seattle-based historical organization. He explained his story to Marie McCaffrey, the co-founder. She understood immediately and began coordinating with Joint Base Lewis-McChord. The base historian, Dwayne Denfield, confirmed that several of the original POW camp buildings still existed. The plan came together, October 3, 2016. Günter Gräwe arrived at JBLM's Liberty Gate on a clear autumn morning, a bicycle in tow. He wore civilian clothes and a determined expression. Military police motorcycles were waiting to escort him. Colonel William Percival, deputy garrison commander, greeted him personally. Media had gathered, local news crews intrigued by the story of an elderly German returning to thank his captors. Gräwe seemed unfazed by the attention. He had come for a specific purpose, and nothing would distract him. The ride from the gate to the old POW campsite was several miles. Gräwe pedaled steadily, the motorcycle escort flanking him, Colonel Percival following in a vehicle. The base had changed enormously since 1944. Modern buildings, paved roads, sophisticated infrastructure. But patches of old-growth forest remained, and the mountains in the distance were unchanged. Gräwe stopped occasionally, looking around, trying to match his memories to the current landscape. 72 years was a long time. Memory played tricks. But when they reached the cluster of brown wooden buildings, all that remained of 60 barracks, his face lit with recognition. They toured one of the surviving structures together. The interior had been renovated, used for storage now, but the bones of the building were original. Gräwe walked slowly through the space, his hand trailing along the wall. "My bed was over there," he said, pointing to a corner. His English was heavily accented but clear. It was a bunk bed. The building must have been improved later. It wasn't as nice as this. He smiled, a small, private smile. Colonel Percival watched quietly, understanding that he was witnessing something rare, a moment of historical closure, a circle completing after 7 decades. Outside, Gräwe stood in the space that had once been the yard between barracks. The soccer field was long gone, the guard towers demolished. But he could see it all in his mind's eye. Young men in German uniforms playing football, laughing, momentarily forgetting they were prisoners. American guards watching from the perimeter, bored and homesick. The canteen where he'd bought his first Coca-Cola. All of it overlaid on the current landscape like a ghost. He turned to the small crowd that had gathered. Base personnel, historians, reporters. His voice was steady. "I came to say thank you," Gräwe said. "I was treated with humanity when I had no right to expect it. I was fed when my own country couldn't feed its people. I was paid for my work. I was allowed to buy ice cream and Coca-Cola. These small things, they seem small, but they're everything. They're the difference between civilization and barbarism." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "When I see what's happening in the world today, the cruelty, the torture of prisoners, I think about this place and I'm grateful. 72 years later, I'm still grateful." The moment hung in the air. No one spoke. What was there to say? Here was a man who'd fought for the Third Reich, however briefly, however unwillingly, returned to thank the nation that had defeated his homeland. It was an act of moral courage that transcended politics or nationality. It was one human being acknowledging his debt to others who'd chosen mercy when they could have chosen cruelty. Colonel Percival shook Gräwe's hand. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Your story is a reminder of what we're supposed to stand for. Not just military power, but the values that power is meant to protect." They talked for a few more minutes about the Marshall Plan, about Germany's post-war recovery, about the importance of remembering history fully, not just the battles and the victories, but the small daily choices that define who we are. Gräwe rode his bicycle back to the Liberty Gate. The escort followed at a respectful distance. At 91 years old, pedaling across a military base in a country that had once been his enemy, he looked neither old nor defeated. He looked purposeful, like a man completing a mission he'd carried for most of his life. At the gate, he posed for photos with the military police officers, thanked everyone profusely, and prepared to leave. But first, he had one more thing to say. "My stay here was the best treatment I've ever received," he told Marie McCaffrey. "Better than in my own country. Better than I deserved. That's something worth remembering, I think. That even in war we have choices about how we treat each other. And those choices matter, they echo across lifetimes." Günter Gräwe returned to Germany shortly after. He died less than 2 years later in 2018 at the age of 93. His sons and grandson continued the family business, building on the foundation he'd laid in the ruins of post-war Germany. But his story lived on, a testament to an era when one nation chose, however imperfectly, to treat its defeated enemies with a measure of humanity. In the vast catalog of World War II stories, it's a footnote. One prisoner among millions. One canteen among thousands. One cup of Coca-Cola in an ocean of suffering. But for Günter Gräwe, standing in that canteen in 1944, young and wounded and far from home, it was everything. It was the moment he learned that the enemy he'd been taught to hate was capable of kindness. That victory didn't have to mean vengeance. That the war Germany lost was also, in a profound sense, the war humanity won. He carried that lesson for 72 years, across continents and decades, until he could return and say the two words that mattered most: thank you. And in saying them, he reminded us all that memory, gratitude, and the choice to see our shared humanity. These things endure long after the guns fall silent and the barracks crumble into dust.